thank you for coming out on this wonderful Sunday morning. It's a lot nicer than a couple of days ago. We got lucky. It's actually a little warmer than I would have liked for some of our infrared pictures, but we'll give you a sense of it. I will give the first half of the presentation or so, then we'll transition over to Melissa. And the first piece that we wanted to talk about is to just give you a sense of how these buildings compare to similar buildings in similar use structure. And so it's always important to have that kind of national benchmark, give you a sense of, is this building already fairly efficient, or is it sort of average or below average? What we have is essentially three different uses for the space, which makes it a little complicated. We have the sanctuary, which is used in a different way than the offices, which is used in a different way than the annex and the school building. And so what we looked at for the benchmark, to give us a sense, was we looked at sort of national data associated with religious buildings and with offices and schools. As you would probably expect, the religious buildings have a smaller footprint, smaller energy use per square foot, because they're not used as continuously throughout the week as an office or a school building is. So we'll talk about what a BTU here is in a second. That's a unit of heat energy. We can convert both heating and electricity into that unit, and it gives us a sense of the scale. So typical religious buildings in our climate zone, they lump New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey together as one block. About 58,000 BTU per square foot, and a little less than twice that for an office building or a school. The BTU is the British thermal unit, so like everything else in the US, we're stuck with the old English unit. The British thermal unit is the amount of heat needed to raise 1 pound of water 1 degree Fahrenheit. Most of our energy use in these buildings is going to be connected to heating, and so we usually use the heating unit. Simple way to think of it is a BTU is about the heat energy in one kitchen match. And so that's why that number is so big, right? 58,000 BTUs per square foot per year. A single BTU is not a whole lot of energy. So compared against those benchmarks, the 58,000 and the 101,000 BTU, if you take last year's energy bills for all of the buildings put together, which is this building and both floors of the annex, it works out to about 125,000 BTU per square foot. If you divide up the square footage between the two buildings, the office space and the annex should be closer to this 100. The sanctuary and some of the other spaces you would expect to be closer to the 58,000. So on average, we come out with a number that says these buildings are using about 33% more energy than the comparable buildings. So they're not bad. They're not far off from the average, but they're not already super efficient. So there's going to be some low-hanging fruit, some easier things that we can look at. And so my half of the talk, we're going to look at some of the options, some of the things that can be done for lowering the energy use of the building, particularly heating. And then Melissa will pick up looking at electricity and how you can look at alternate supply sources to get away from the fossil fuels in the electricity side. And so, this one's out of line here. Just wanted to give you, I almost forgot what this picture is. Right? So it's a little hard to tell what this one is. This is an infrared picture of the outside of the office building. And I wanted to show you the kinds of things that are likely driving some of that higher than average use. So this is the ground. This is the cold vegetation that is in the air. It's down around 40 degrees outside right now. The exterior of the building, the upstairs parts of the building are pretty well insulated. They're showing up as pretty blue. What this is the basement wall that's above grade. And so what you're seeing is that the basement wall is not as insulated as the upstairs. And so essentially all the way around that rim, wherever you see the brick, the building is leaking heat at a much higher rate. You can see that it's about 10 degrees warmer in some places than the rest of the building. So So those kind of pieces are driving a little bit of it. There are other things. This is in your crawl space. This is some of the piping for the hot water system. And so those pipes are relatively uninsulated in there, so you can see they're 80-degree pipes and 50-degree air, so you're losing some of that energy into the cold air. And then you have these cold spots at the edge of where the crawl space meets the building, where colder air is leaking in. And so the building envelope overall looks quite good. There's been quite a lot of work that's been already done, particularly in the sanctuary. Looking around, there was no obvious places. You don't have a whole wall missing insulation or something easy to fix, but there are a number of these kind of smaller pieces that we saw. So why do we split natural gas and electricity? Why is it that we're starting with the heating load, the natural gas side of it? The current energy system that we have is dominated by fossil fuels, both for heating and for electricity. This split here is on-site natural gas. It's important to remember, of course, that electricity is also quite a bit of natural gas in New York State. So we're talking about on-site gas used principally for heating versus electricity that we're currently buying from the grid. Right now, about 80% of all primary energy in the U.S. is coming from fossil fuels, and a big chunk of the rest is coming from nuclear power. And the reason that we started with natural gas is because the main risks associated with fossil fuels, the main reason this whole talk exists, why do we want to move the buildings away from fossil fuels, is because of climate change. And so if you look at last year's energy use and you split out the carbon footprint for the two halves, for natural gas and electricity use, even though they're actually pretty much closer in terms of the actual amount of energy used for heating or electricity, about 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions that FUSIT is responsible for comes from your natural gas usage. Only about 30% come from electricity. And that has to do with the fact that in New York, a lot of our electricity that isn't from natural gas is coming from nuclear, which has very low greenhouse gas emissions to begin with. So natural gas is going to have a lot higher, is a lot bigger part of your footprint, and therefore one that we have to focus on. So what is the existing heating system, and what are some of the lower hanging fruit pieces? So what we're going to look at is a bunch of different pieces. If you have questions along the way, I'm happy to take clarification anytime you want, because we're going to look at several different things, and you don't want to try to necessarily hold a question in your mind all the way through all the different technologies. The other thing that we'll say is that what we're going to present, with the exception of solar, which has an easier time sort of creating the whole economic model, is we're going to look at possibilities. The question then would be to actually take the ones that were of greatest interest and actually break them down and get into the nitty-gritty. And so a couple of things to note, that the distribution systems in these buildings are actually pretty complicated in the number of different ways that you're getting heat into your spaces. So a lot of areas use these baseboard heaters. So these are hot water baseboard heaters. When turned on, these heat up to around 130 degrees at their current temperature. The heat then simply diffuses out from these into the room. In places like the sanctuary, you have these air blower systems which are using that hot water, and then have a fan system that is blowing the heat out from these in order to heat that much larger space. And one of the things that we'll see is where and how you distribute the heat will make a big difference in how much you use. Many of these are all along walls, and you can see that this heater is directly underneath those three stained glass windows. And so this is an infrared picture of those three stained glass windows. And what you can see is that window that's directly above the hot air blower for the heating system is actually getting quite a bit of heat. And this is a concern because glass is a very poor insulator. And so a lot of this heat that you're blowing up is actually leaking out through that window rather than going into your space. You can see even just to the left or to the right of it, those windows are as much as 20 degrees colder than that center window, which means quite a bit more heat is moving out that way.
Right. Do you happen to have a corresponding photo of the outside of those windows?
I took an outside photo of the other stained glass windows. And so the difference is a little less dramatic for the other ones, but again, the center window is the one directly above the heating element, and you can see that the outside panes of glass are going to be a little bit cooler for that one. But this would be something to look at. It may even be just a question of the way that air is directed that comes out, to find a way to direct it away from the windows rather than to allow it to loft straight up into those windows.
That spot though, is that on the stone or is that on the window?
This is on the stone, yeah, between the two windows. Yeah. The warmer the color, the hotter the temperature, and so this is on 44 degrees, so that's that stone between the two windows.
Right, I guess I'm asking the question because on the inside you had the spot on the window itself.
Yes, I couldn't get far enough back without going into the street.
Not right.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to show the comparison between the two windows. Yeah. So in spaces like this one, they're being heated by the air circulators. So at the back of the room, we have the air circulators that are providing ventilation for this space. And at the same time, inside that unit is an electric resistive heater, so it's heating the air that it's blowing out into a room like this. So some of your spaces are heated by forced air rather than off that boiler unit.
What was the thing on the bottom?
Oh, this is the return.
This what?
The return, so the hot air comes out here and then the air gets sucked out of there. You have at least one space that we found with the old-fashioned radiators, and so this was in the little classroom that's right down around the corner here. These radiators are only in that space, at least as far as we could tell. So all of the bits of distribution are controlled by one of two different control technologies. All of the ones that are the hot water systems, all of the ones that have either the baseboard or the blower system like the sanctuary, are controlled off of thermostats. And these allow you to control day-night cycles to be able to set them down at night and ramp them back up in the day.
Can I ask a question?
Oh yeah, of course.
Is that efficient?
Yes.
My father used to scream at me all the time about I watched TV late at night, and then my job was to turn down the thermostat, but I forget. And then I heard later that keeping it at one temperature is more efficient than going up and down.
It really depends on the type of heating source that you have. For the kind of natural gas boilers that you have here, that are quite big compared to your heating load, it is more efficient to turn them down at night. The basic way that works is that the rate at which heat is going to leak out of your building depends on the delta T, the temperature difference across the wall. And so the extra heat you need when you pump it back in is generally offset. There are a few things, depending on how you're moving heat with, say, a ground source heat pump, those you don't necessarily want to set back at night to the same extent. No, it is actually a very interesting question. You look on the internet and you'll find lots of answers, and then eventually someone works all the numbers for it.
Grace, I think it also sometimes when you get into different distribution systems, so if you have a radiant floor in your home or something, that's a very different thing than...
And that's why with heat pumps, sometimes people have things like radiant floors that you would want to
Big
consider.
thermal mats.
Yeah, big thermal mats.
Russ, in the last photo with the old cast iron radiator, I mean, I was under the impression those are actually more efficient than the blower systems because you're actually, first of all, heat rises. Those contain the heat and radiate out. And then your blower system, even in the one before that, it's heating the ceiling in a way, and then there's more energy needed to pull it down below and circulate.
In a shorter room, that is a question of whether you're just heating the ceiling directly. In the sanctuary where those are, the ceiling is far enough up that you're heating the wall, and that's certainly true, but you're not going to get the ceiling very much.
And the cast iron?
And well, yeah, I'll actually show you a couple of pictures. The cast iron ones, the reason that they're not more efficient is that the way that they're going to distribute the heat is to require a convection loop to form. So the warm air rises off of here, reaches the front of the room, which is colder, and cycles back through. But anything you put in the room, like the desks and chairs or people, disrupt that airflow. And so you get stagnant heat by the windows. I'll show you actually a picture from Cortland where we have, this is our only source of heat in some buildings. The students will actually keep the windows open at the back of the room in the middle of winter because it can be as much as 85 degrees back there for them, and the front of the room where the instructor is freezing. And so there's actually a way to make these much more efficient. I'll show you one possibility there.
They're also very dangerous for children to be around.
They can get much hotter than the other ones. Yeah. And they also, over time, they will, the pipes can fill up with, yeah, exactly. And I'll show you one of ours where only about half of it is actually still receiving heat because the rest of the pipes are blocked. So these systems, there's a number of different models. This is just one particular one at one place. My picture turned out way too fuzzy here, but in rooms like this, that little tiny box on the back of the wall there, that's actually your only control over the heating for this room. So it basically just has a little wheel. Part of it is red for hot, part of it is blue for cold, and there's no control over it that's more fine than that. No temperature scale, even just hot and cold for the two options, warmer or cooler. And so these will be one area where there might be some lower hanging fruit. So that's the distribution side. On your supply side, there are two different systems for the two buildings. I chose to focus on the one that connects to the sanctuary, this part of the building, and into the office space. It's heated by these four units here. They're all connected basically in series. And interestingly enough, we just found that pipe runs right through, they ran the exhaust pipe right through the old chimney stack. And that's why this wall right here is noticeably warmer than the rest of the space. That's where that exhaust heat goes out of these pieces. These four boiler units we're going to look at in some detail. It turns out most heating systems were designed much bigger than they need to be, and that influences the efficiency of your system. And so I took your heating bill from last year, and if you normalize it to an average winter, this starts here on October 1, and it ends here at the end of March. And the temperature swings up and down for each day, but generally you can see it gets colder as we get towards January and February. That's where you have the highest heating demand, and then it starts to come back down. What's over here is how much of the capacity of those four boilers you used on average during the day. And so even on sort of your coldest days, over the course of the day, you're not using more, you're not even getting up to half the capacity of those four boilers put together. And that turns out to be not terribly unusual. A factor of 2 overbuilding shows up in a lot of heating systems. And they don't want you to be cold, so just throw another couple units in there, whether or not you need them or what it does to your efficiency. And what it does to your efficiency is this is the sort of maximum theoretical efficiency of the types of boilers you have. They're around 80% efficient, maybe 81%. If they're run up near their full capacity, as you run a boiler at lower capacity, it's not too bad for a while, and below about 50% though, it starts to lose efficiency. And so oversizing boilers, having them bigger than they need to be, can mean that they're not running as close to their efficiency.
Question, do you know how old they are, how long they'll last?
1992.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that's one of the reasons why they're up to 80%. So they're from 1992, so they're just over 20 years.
I know school systems that boilers that die and that it was cold.
Yep. Yeah. No. I mean, our boilers at Cortland, when they finally took them offline, they were built in 1958. And so for us, we got a 30 or 35% increase in efficiency just by taking those really old boilers offline.
Do we need 4 boilers?
No, I mean that's
That's
one.
what you're saying,
That's
quantity.
one. Yeah, that right now having 4 boilers, even on the worst day, which is what we'll say here. So even if you look at what is considered your design load, so what I showed you before was the average use throughout the day. Even if you take the design temperature, which for us is around -5 degrees Fahrenheit outside, even then you're only approaching 45% of the capacity of those 4 boilers. And the average over the whole winter is around 20% over the whole heating season in terms of its capacity. Yep.
If I'm understanding your graph and not coming all the way to even 50%, does that mean that at the coldest day there's still only 2 boilers working?
We'd have to know more about how your system is controlled, and that would be one of the recommendations that I'll make. Is that even on the coldest day, that we're designing the system for, we should only expect 2 of those boilers to actually be active. But when we looked downstairs, all 4 boilers are hot, even on today. Yeah, and so
it would be more efficient to have fewer, or rather to have maybe 4 boilers, but all of them be smaller.
Or to stage them and only bring them online as the capacity is needed. You have a control system. We weren't able to see how much smarts it has.
You got the actual cost last year for gas and electric?
Not all of it. When I was going through the bills, I only copied down part of the cost, so I only got sort of half the electric cost.
Does anybody here know?
I think the total basic bill for this building last year was around $6,000, something like that.
Yeah, it would have been what I guessed. When I used just an average cost, I got around $7,000.
And that's just for electric?
That's just for gas. Yeah. That's just for gas, and then the electric is on top of that. Yeah. And the electric, I think, looked like it was around 2,000 or 3,000. 3,200, I think.
Ish.
And so what we find is since since the system is oversized for the demand, if you're running on average down around 20%, you're probably only running the boilers for a large part of the year somewhere between 70 and 75% efficient. So it's not terribly far away from their maximum of 80. But it is burning gas that's not needed, and if your control system can be made to stage them, which it looks like it should be able to do, that would be essentially a no-cost option. One of the interesting case studies we found, we didn't present it because their building was so bad at the beginning, they had it really easy. But there was a Unitarian church in Minneapolis that they found that their heating system ran at 100% capacity for the entire 180 days of the heating season. Because someone had gone through and deactivated all of the controls. It just turned on and just ran and then turned it off at the end of the year. And so control systems are a big part of how, for relatively small amounts of money, you can sometimes get big efficiencies.
It was my understanding, because I was involved in doing a lot of the reconstruction and stuff, that these boilers were supposed to be staged, and it's possible the control system is no longer working.
That is exactly the thing that would be the first recommendation to look at. Is that we found the control system and it's lit up. It thinks it's alive, but right now it is running. Has all 4 boilers up to temperature, which it shouldn't.
Sure.
And so even with one of those boilers turned off, your coldest day would only get up to about 60% the capacity of the other 3. And so we really, on a day like today, should have seen at least 2 of those boilers cold. And the fact that they're not gives at least one place that you might make some quick improvements on for natural gas. Place where electricity comes into the heating element a little bit. Right now, the pumps that drive the heating supply, so this is the supply water here for the heat, is essentially just a little 2-horsepower motor that is on or off. It's not variable speed. It just turns on and pumps at a constant power regardless of how much heat is actually needed. And so particularly in the shoulder seasons, when some of the rooms will be already up to temperature and not need that heat, this will still have to run at full capacity. And you can see here it is running now. You can see that the motor is electrically heating itself to about 133 degrees. And so running these motors at full speed all the time, whenever they click on, actually puts quite a bit of wear on these motors. And so there's a big savings that you can make by looking at switching away from the constant speed motor to what are called variable speed pumps. So when only part of the building needs heat, two things happen. That motor kicks on, so it's actually moving the water faster through the rest of the systems because the shutoff valves have been closed in the other parts, and it's raising the pressure. And that does two things. One, it needlessly uses the pump's energy to move that water when it wasn't needed, but it also means that the water that's supposed to heat the other spaces goes zipping through the heating system much faster, so it actually leaves less heat behind in the other part of the building. And you saw that how much it was heating up. It was 130 some degrees. It puts excess wear on the pumps. That pumps are outside my expertise, but when you look at it, they say cutting the power by a factor of 2 can increase the life by a factor of 7 because you're running at a much lower power for them. So there's quite a few companies that sell what are called variable frequency drives that can connect to the motors and control them to make variable speed pumps for these kind of heating systems. These usually have pretty good paybacks because the energy reductions are so dramatic compared to just running that pump on and off. And so this would be another one that I think would be worth looking at as a potentially simple solution. A quick sort of back of the envelope, you could save maybe as much as 1,000 kilowatt hours, depending on how the occupancy of the spaces are. So future systems, these are the sort of the higher hanging fruits. These are the ones that aren't going to give you the quick, easy payback times and are to be considered in the context of all of the non-economic things that we currently build into our energy. Right now, when we pay for that unit of natural gas, we're just paying what it costs someone to get it out of the ground and get it to us. We're not paying the associated costs from the climate impacts that it has. We're not paying the associated impacts that it has on the communities where that hydrofracking was done. Even if we don't have hydrofracking in New York, it's expected over the next 50 years, essentially 100% of new natural gas supplies over and above our current values are going to come exclusively from shale gas somewhere. And so even if it's not shale gas from us, it's shale gas from somewhere. And so some of the things that are a little bigger investment that would be worth looking at as you decide sort of what that path is going to look like for you if you wanted to get rid of fossil fuels. One is an actual energy management system. And so this is just one that Siemens makes. They're for small businesses. Big buildings have a lot of choices for energy management systems, but people are now realizing that essentially buildings like this, which they would consider a small business, small commercial scale building, what it entails is thermostats that are now not only programmable but can talk back to a control system, and so you can program a much more fine-tuned occupancy. So in our buildings that we have on campus, for instance, our building management system knows when we're going to have a class in that room and when we're not, and can turn each individual room's thermostats up and down based on a programmed expectation of occupancy. then it actually can monitor the use and warn you if a particular zone, a particular place is using an unexpectedly large amount of power. Was that heating system overridden? Did someone come in and turn the thermostat up every day and not let the control system do it? These monitors essentially monitor how much power that each individual zone is using. All of that talks back to a controller, and because these are meant for small businesses that don't have full-time facilities people, it all dumps to the website in a very kind of click and point drag, very simple interface that is usable by very short amount of training. Sorry.
All of our building is zoned in different ways. It has these three-phase zone bells, which have to be placed numerous times. And apparently there's no solution to this particular problem. Plumbing is what it is. So I don't know what we can do about that. But anyway, in theory, the way the building is zoned, particularly in the terrace portion, and that it should be an energy efficient process, but we're not sure that it actually is.
The question would be to actually have someone monitor the temperature profile over the course of a month. A typical sort of starting point to consider whether a building management system is worthwhile. The DOE recommends a month-long analysis. So they look at the heat profile over the course of every day, and they look at the electrical consumption over the course of every 24-hour period. And then what they look for is places where the system is behaving in ways that you hadn't either intended or ways that just weren't recognized as inefficient. And it may, at the end of that time, find that there's not much more you can do. But it's a relatively low-cost first step to seeing if something like this is worthwhile. Some of the bigger ticket items would then be the actual attempt to move fully away from the natural gas as your heating source. So right now we've talked mostly about how to reduce the consumption to try to bring that energy use down closer to the benchmarks. There are two competing technologies that can use high-efficiency electricity to heat, one of which is a good deal more possible for you here, and that's air source heat pumps. And the idea is that this unit that's outside is attempting to extract heat from the outside air. Even when the outside air is 20 or 30 degrees, there is actual heat there that you can extract, and if you can do that efficiently, you can take the heat from the outside air and actually bring it inside to these indoor blower units, and the overall efficiency of these is about 200%, which means for every BTU of energy you feed this thing as electricity to run the pumps and the compressor, you get 2 BTUs of heat that shows up inside your house. And so in terms of efficiency, these can be a big difference. And one thing that you have is you have a couple of spaces that are right now using just pure electric resistant heating, which is the air handlers here. If those were instead using a heat pump, you would cut the energy used to heat and cool these kind of spaces by about a factor of 2. Of course, the cost effectiveness depends on how often these few spaces are actually used, and how much they're used in winter versus summer, and the question. The typical cost for one of these systems is about $2,500 per ton. The ton is your standard heating unit that your furnace or boiler at home is. So you have a couple of spaces that might be particularly good because you're already using electricity to heat, and you're using it in a less efficient way. And so the cost reductions for heating the space might be able to pay those back. It would be something that you would look at in terms of this space and the downstairs space, which are both forced air.
What's the comparison between the current cost of this sort of heat versus natural gas?
And yeah, if you were replacing against natural gas, it really depends on how big the system has to be and what else you can do. the unit price, electricity, even at 200% efficiency, is more expensive than burning gas. And that's why, in order to consider the next couple of steps where you would move not just from the couple of spaces that currently use electricity inefficiently to heat, would actually have a fairly sizable price tag up front. Now, if natural gas prices change from their historic levels and were to increase more rapidly than they could, those numbers could look very different. So the other technology, the other heat pump that you may have heard about, it's called a ground source heat pump. It does the same basic idea that here you're extracting heat from the ground, and you send the cold water out and the ground heats it up, and you're getting all that heat energy from the ground for free, just as you were getting the energy that it could extract from the air without having to supply it. The difference is that the ground is basically always at about 50 degrees once you go down a few feet, and therefore instead of trying to extract energy from 20-degree air, you're extracting heat from 50-degree ground. So these are more efficient. Instead of 200% efficient, they're 350% efficient. So they cost even less to operate, but they have a higher upfront cost because you have to drill the holes to get the heat exchanger. And so to get 100% of your heat from a ground source would be about $165,000 or so. I'm sorry? Yeah, and that's the question.
We don't have space. We looked at this number.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if it's this number at the bottom here that causes the problem for ground source. You'd need an area at least of 110 feet by 110 feet in order to drill all those wells. The wells have to be spaced about 20 feet on center. And so unless you were to acquire a parking lot or something nearby, it would be very difficult with your current configuration to find enough space to get a sizable fraction from geothermal. So if you do the same question for air source and accept the lower efficiencies of operation, it could be done. You could get your heat load from air source heat pumps. The capital cost is less because you're not drilling into the ground. So it would be about $90,000 to install, buy and install the air source heat pumps. But for every unit of heat, they're about 45% more expensive than ground source heat pumps because they're less efficient. They need more electricity bought. And the part Melissa will talk about is these can both then be powered off of a solar array if the church was to move in that direction. Right? If you went with solar, it would actually not be an enormous system. In fact, it would still be a rather modest-sized system, even to get 100% of your electricity and 100% of the extra electricity to run these.
Bryce, I went to the solar green home tour, and Craig Monisher's new houses have the slim in them. It's a Mitsubishi, I think. So that doesn't have an exterior handler. It creates its own hot air, which it hangs and blows down onto the ground. So why couldn't we not use it?
It does have an outside piece.
It just has a small.
It just has a small one.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, because I didn't see that.
Yeah, because you have to have a source for the heat, and that's coming from the outside air.
So that,
But it's flexible. It's non-duct work. It's a small
Correct.
pipe that runs in, so you just don't necessarily see where that unit is. It doesn't have to be right across from the unit.
Sometimes on buildings I get the Aurora welding circles down here. You know, they actually hung the little outside unit on the side of the house.
okay.
So maybe, I don't know what he did at his place, but he could have tucked it away somewhere.
Yeah, it wasn't even seen.
But yeah, definitely is, I mean, the whole principle is air exchange with the air and outside, and so it has to have an outside unit.
Yeah, but depending on how big your heat load is, they don't have to be a big unit.
Right.
So it would be pretty easy
Sure,
to
his
hide
house
them.
is really tight, so probably really small.
So building envelope improvements, so we saw that opening example of where the basement could have some additional insulation on the top feet. There's basically three ways heat can move. Conduction is through direct transfer, right? You stick something in the fire and it moves down the rod. Convection is when the heated air moves. Radiation is the least important in homes, so you just generally ignore radiation transfer. So this is sort of how the sun gets to us, but we don't have to worry about it as much in homes. So the radiator example that we talked about, This is one of our buildings at school. It wasn't cold enough here and that place wasn't turned on. This is a building at school, and these you can see are where the radiators are, just going right, radiating right through the walls. And then when you look at the radiators themselves, right, they're 210 degrees, largely using steam, but you can see that a whole big chunk of it has been blocked off and there's no more steam flow through the system, so only about 2/3 of it is actually heated. There are lots of neat ways that you can really low-cost retrofit. There's a company called Radiator Labs. Essentially, they just put an insulating blanket over the top of it, a little computer fan, and a little duct blows out, blows air over the radiator and blows it out into the room and insulates the radiator, so when you stop calling for heat, the radiator then really does keep the heat inside of it a lot more than if you just let it radiate to the room. You avoid the hot spots and you get a much more even distribution. And these things are super cheap to construct because they're just an insulating blanket and a little computer fan and a small amount of electronics to control it all. So this is just one example of one company, but there are ways that you could have a pretty low-cost retrofit for radiators. Other things about the building envelope that are important, particularly in places like the sanctuary, is what's called the stack effect. Any leak that you have at the bottom of your building is drawing in cold air. The cold air then is heated and rises. And if you have air leaks at the top, you've created essentially a chimney, and you're bringing cold air at the bottom, it's heated up, and then you blow it out the top of the building. So any penetration that's near the top of your building is really important to air seal. So this is your ladder that goes up into the attic right around the corner there. If you look at it in the infrared camera, you can see that it's not terrible, but this could be sealed in a little better and have a little bit of insulation on the back side of it. It would prevent that as a place to leak. The taller the building, the bigger the stack effect is, because you simply have more height for this heat to be lofted in. So for a tall building, it can be 2 or 4 times the impact on a home. So in a place like the sanctuary with a high wall, any penetration here is going to matter, as well as any source of infiltration. So you have that vestibule with the double doors, but when you open the inside door and prop them open, then that every time someone opens the door, you're getting a big gust of outside air into the bottom of your building, which then heats and gets lofted up inside the space up to that top of the building. So even if those doors were kept closed only during times when the sanctuary was used, it might actually have a bigger impact than you would expect. And then we have discovered that we found a couple of places that just simply haven't been quite finished yet. So this is in your coat closet. This just has foam, but it hasn't been sealed in. And so there's not many of these. It's quite a lot that's been done to your sanctuary already. But we found a few bits, a few cracks along the way. There are cracks in the wall that allow some air infiltration in. So this is at the edge of those 2 archways. These are the 2 lights, can lights that are there that you can see. And if you look at the wall, there's actually a visible little crack here right at the edge, and you're getting a little bit of air penetration there. And the same thing happens, here's that door to the sanctuary that's propped open, and it's actually in close proximity to your heating source. So every time that outside door opens, you're actually going to have cold air exchanging right with the air that you're trying to use to heat the whole place. So that cold air comes in, gets heated, and it's going to get lofted much more than some other places. So even something as simple as closing those doors could have a big impact. Inside of walls, you can get radiative transport. The nice thing is that this has been pretty well taken care of. We didn't have the infrared camera until this morning. And so what happens if the wall cavity is filled or stationary with air, you don't get these loops of air that can form inside your wall. And the walls that you have are pretty good. There was no really big cold spots. And so this is one that seems to be pretty well taken care of, at least in the sanctuary where we looked pretty closely.
Bryce, and the only exception was the basement walls, but those didn't have a cavity at all. They were just
Right, those were
rock.
just straight transferred across the wall. Yeah, that wasn't convective loops. In really old homes, where you have just walls with no insulation in them, this actually becomes a really big deal because you have that cavity behind your drywall, and the loop here, as the warm, cold air gets heated, rises, moves to the cold outside edge. You actually get a little heat pump right inside the wall that's pumping your nice hot air outside to the outside. So when we look at all of the building energy improvements, there's an awful lot that can be done. This is a sort of a multi-family home in Germany. This gives you an infrared image of what it looks like before. The walls are reasonably well insulated. You can see the windows have a little bit of leakage around the corner, pretty similar to what we would see here. This was retrofitted quite extensively to something called passive house standards. The idea is to reduce the energy load to the point where passive solar heating is nearly enough to heat your home. There's a person in Colorado who heats his entire house just with the sunlight through this greenhouse, and just to prove he can do it, he grows banana trees in the Rocky Mountains with no external heating whatsoever.
Do you know how many days of sun they have compared to this?
They do have, their sunlight is about, was it like 15% more than ours? It's on that ballpark. So they have about 15% more solar energy.
Solar is amazing.
Yeah. But the intensity is different too as well because of the difference in our altitudes. And so this space, just to give you a sense of what was possible, this was after they retrofitted the building. Now you can see the walls are heavily insulated. They've gone to double pane windows that are well sealed in. And they actually cut 90% of the heat load out of this building. So this is not perhaps as far as you want to take your envelope right now, but I think an interesting interim target to explore was through some of these activities, through staging of your boilers, through sealing some of those air cracks, through insulating some of the basement walls and the crawl spaces, the pipes. You are using about 1/3 more energy than the benchmark, the sort of average of all buildings like this. So it seemed reasonable that we could probably find, when you put a sharp pencil to it, at least 1/3 of that energy, that 33% energy there could probably be taken down. And if you price that out in dollars, it depends on exactly whether you're saving electricity or natural gas. But it could be savings of around $2,000 to $3,000, depending on how much you save of which energy. So as you would look at the different strategies for making these improvements, this would sort of be your target. That if you could make 1/3 reduction in your energy, you'd be saving a couple of $1,000s, and that would give you the projected budget that you would be able to look at in terms of how much you could spend. Some of them, like fixing the controller for the boilers, if it really is staging all 4 of them on continuously, that could cost nothing. Putting insulation around the bottom of your basement, that would cost a little bit. Some of the other things would be higher cost. The neat part about all of this, though, is as you move through the series, you'll lower your heat load to making things like the air source heat pumps more effective, more cost effective. And the second half here will be to look at how you could make that final step, which is to move yourself off of fossil fuels entirely by complete electrification with solar energy. So this is where I'll switch over to this. We have a couple of questions. We'll do them maybe just real quick.
What about hot water? Are we on demand?
No, it should be coming from your boiler. At least the controller says that it's controlling your hot water for this building.
What was the source for the benchmarking data? I mean, did you look at EPA's portfolio manager as well, or?
No, I just used EIA, Energy Information Administration, commercial building data. So that was from 2009, I think, or 7, one of those two.
Should we go ahead and try and get a PM score as well? I mean,
I think that there's enough that looks possible that I would say that this should be followed up on. I think there's probably some very cost-effective mix of some near-term options that could save quite a bit.
First, thank you. I find this fascinating. The women in my first Peace Corps village in Senegal had solar panels on their maternity to deliver their children their future safely in 1984 when Carter's solar panels were taken off by Reagan. But the village next to the next one I was in had a windmill, just like your Wizard of Oz old-fashioned windmill, pumping out the water from the well. I'm looking like you with creative solutions. We don't need a bell tower, but are there small windmills now that we could actually, because we're in a confined space, where we could actually put one almost in each corner and do the pump?
It would be interesting to look at that with today's prices, wind turbines, just because they're mechanical devices, they have shorter lifetimes and maintenance issues. Solar is almost always going to be a far more cost-effective option if you can go with it.
For this scale.
Yeah, for this scale. And Melissa will be able to show you how it might work given your space. Wind makes sense at the big scale where you can really put the cost-effective turbines in.
We need to hear her.
Yeah, no, I want to make sure we have time.
Like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Hi guys, I'm Melissa. So I'm currently the director of Solar Tompkins. Thanks Bryce for that great introduction. So I'm going to go on to the electricity usage for these facilities. Just to start off, so looking at your last year of bills, obviously your utility here is NYSEG. Electricity is right around 50,000 kilowatt hours a year. Kilowatt hours and BTUs can all be put in the same units, so we don't have to use these competing units. There's 3,412 BTUs per kilowatt hour if we want to go back and forth. But usually just common people talk about electricity in kilowatt hours and heating in BTUs. So currently, obviously, we're using grid electricity. That's mostly coal from the power plant still running up on the lake, whose future will hopefully be decided soon. And then it's also a mix, as Bryce mentioned earlier, of methane, nuclear, and hydro from a whole bunch of facilities, within 100 plus miles of here. Right now, and I actually would love to go through the bills in more detail, but the cost, according to all the tariffs and the bills that we have seen, is between 6.5 and 7 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's just for the electricity. So there's additional costs, like for having an account with NYSEG, for your demand charges. Those are things that are not directly offset by solar, and we can talk much more about them. But this is for the core electricity that you purchase. That's the cost. Obviously, that's the power plant. So what does this look like going forward? So that 50,000 kilowatt hours a year is easily offset or produced by solar. So you absolutely do have an option of meeting 100% of that with solar. I'll talk about what kind of solar I'm talking about and give some kind of introduction to that in just a minute. To cover 100% of your current usage would be a 45 kilowatt solar system. So what is a 45 kilowatt solar system? Some of you have solar and know all about it. Some of you I'm sure don't. A single solar panel is about 5 foot by 2.5 foot. Each one of those is 250 watts. So if you've got 4 of them, it's 250 times 4 is 1,000 watts or 1 kilowatt. So it would be 45 kilowatts is the kind of system size I'm talking about. It's what we call in the industry like a super large residential or probably just a very small commercial system. So your electricity usage right now is relatively reasonable compared to other commercial buildings. We can do a per square foot number, but this is a very modest system that would take care of 100% of what you're doing today. 2 options for location. There is some potential here on these facilities. We'd have to get into a lot more of the detail, like who has control over the annex roof over there. There is that flat roof over there. There's the pitch roof for the office space. Generally, I have no idea without getting much more into the weeds about control and details whether we could fit 45 kilowatts. It would probably be very tight. It probably would be a little less efficient. I think probably the second option, which is locating a system of this size or in the future bigger, if you choose to make a switch of your heating and cooling to clean electricity, doing it remotely is really has a lot of advantages. So people, and I'll talk about it in a minute, are able to locate solar systems to run this facility elsewhere. And I'll get into the details on that. The economics are actually even better than locating it on site, and in your case, the performance will be better. And you'll have as much room to grow or to add capacity as you want. So here's those 2 options. Here's on-site. Here's the flat roof I was talking about. I wonder who has control over that. There's a little bit of space. You guys do? Okay. I know that the bottom floor is one tenant, right? And then you guys use the second.
We own the building.
You own the building. Okay. I wasn't 100% sure. So there is some potential there. This is all, when you do solar on-site, we use something called net metering. and I'll talk more about it, but net metering is the right to produce your own electricity, clean electricity, to use whatever you need on site in the moment, and to sell back the extra to the utility. So on a beautiful sunny summer day, you'd make a lot more than you would need. You sell that back to NYSEG. They actually pay you under state law, just like we do with homeowners, and we've done all summer with Solar Tompkins. They pay you the full retail rate, and they build up a credit. And then when we have days like now, and as we go into the winter, we don't have as much sun, you use that credit back up. And so net metering is the way of exchanging, equal exchange with the utility when you produce your own clean electricity. There's a version of it called remote net metering, and that's when you can put a solar system on any piece of land within the same load zone, same utility, and with the same name on the account. And so for this, the church obviously, or the church, FUSIT could own land. You guys could own land that you wanted to put a system on. I don't think you do currently. But you can also lease land. Or the developer who builds it for you can lease the land. So you actually don't have to make a capital investment in land to have a remotely located solar system. So Cornell's 2 megawatt system that just came online a few months ago is remotely located. It's not located on their campus, but it's supplying clean electricity to several campus meters. The one that TC3 is doing, which will build this winter or the spring, will be similar. The ones that, the 8 megawatts that Cornell's going to be doing, the city of Ithaca is going to be doing a system, maybe the hospital, all these folks, they're all remote net metered. For you guys, it's definitely an option. With remote net metering, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but you actually get paid a higher rate. So you guys are paying, 6.5 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour here at these facilities. For a remote net metered system, based on the meter classification, you would likely be being paid to around 10 cents a kilowatt hour for everything you made there. So for financial reasons and logistical reasons, one great option might be to locate a 50 kilowatt system to start, and then maybe a bigger system in the future on a piece of property somewhere outside of Ithaca that can be connected back on paper to covering 100% of the electricity of these facilities. Does people get that?
Yeah. So Deborah and I have been talking about this for a year, and we have 7 acres of land that we're not going to build on. It's considered really landlocked. And we would absolutely do this for the church.
So that was definitely a possibility. I mean, the only thing that has to happen is we have to have control of the site, and I'll talk about the financing options in a minute, so how this thing is actually paid for, gets taken into account, but that would be a great use for such property. For a system of this size too, when you get to bigger systems, you run into costs for interconnection. For a 50 kilowatt or 100 kilowatt or 200 kilowatt, there's probably unlikely to be such a problem for a cost. So that would make it even more sense.
And just to let you know, for the 4th month in a row, our bill has been 0.
Good. So you guys have a system that was put in last year, which is wonderful.
You might get to this later on, so you can tell me.
Sure.
Shut up. But what kind of incentives are allowed for nonprofits?
Yep. So I'll get to hold that thought. I'll get into the financials in just a minute. So I'm going to go through this real quick because I think we're behind schedule. How many people are familiar with solar PV? I'll go through. So solar PV, there's a couple types of solar technology. Solar PV is the most common one. It's one if you've been in town all summer, you've heard people talking about it. The PV stands for photovoltaics. It's a type of solar that makes clean electricity. It's what you see on McGuire's car dealership, on Elmira Savings Bank, on AFCU, at Deb and Joanne's house. I mean, lots of folks have it now. It's the common technology that people are talking about, but there are other types that are talked about less frequently, at least in our state. It can be roof or ground mounted. It produces electricity. That's the technology that I'm focused on here this morning. New York, this is a question that came up earlier. Do we have a good resource? It's cloudy out there today. Isn't New York kind of cold and cloudy and not really solary? No, actually we do quite well. We've got 30 plus years of data. We have about 2/3 of the solar resource as the Southwest does. So if you're down in Phoenix or San Diego, on an annual basis, we've got 2/3, 66% of what they do. So we actually do quite well. We just don't feel like it for a big chunk of the winter. This technology, this industry is growing incredibly rapidly. Solar Tompkins, which is what I've been in the weeds amongst other things in the last 6 months, we're doubling the amount of residential solar in the county that was put in, to date. Which is great. And that's happening, in whole counties and whole states and whole countries. And this stuff is taking off. It's doubling every year, and that's kind of the track that we need and are now going to be on. Right now, solar PV, if you look at it in all sectors, residential, commercial, and industrial, and when I say commercial, I mean nonprofits as well, we're about 1%. Solar is making up 1% of the total electricity use in the county currently. We're on track to, by the summer of next year, so July of 2015, to be somewhere either between 2 and 4%, depending on how bullish you want to be. But that's including the Solar Tompkins work in the residential sector. Cornell just got allocated another 8 megawatts of solar, which is in this bullish projection. But then all these other systems that are already agreed to and scheduled to come online. So we're really ramping up. This is still a very small number, but we're taking up this rate of adoption quite dramatically, and our goal is to sustain that. That's actually Cornell's system that was just commissioned, but a few weeks ago they had the Solarbration, that's what they call it. So that's their first 2 megawatt system, and they just were awarded another 8, so another 4 of these that they plan to build in the next year. Why is this happening? Obviously, pricing, rapid drop in pricing. When I got into the solar industry in 2006, a long time ago now, it was over 3 times as much as expensive as it is today. So the prices come down quite dramatically. That's what's graphed here, and we can talk to people who are interested in why that's happened and everything. We can talk about that offline. But there are incentives, and I'll get into the details of what this would mean for you guys as a nonprofit. In the straight residential or straight commercial sector, meaning not a nonprofit, they cover 60 to 70% of the total cost. You guys are in a different situation because you're not a income tax paying or property tax paying entity. And so because of that, I'm going to recommend a very specific type of financial path for you. Components, we don't really have time to get into the details here, but the panels, they're what you see outside. These are things that we're typically facing south, southeast, southwest, east, or west. In a case like this, where we're thinking maybe off-site would be ideal, they'd be perfectly south and they'd be roof or ground mounted. They are very long-lived systems. We're talking about a system that the fundamental components have a 25-year warranty, which I don't think I know about a warranty that long for anything else. They don't have moving parts, as Bryce was mentioning, so the price of solar has come down on this kind of scale, light commercial. It's much cheaper than wind, has no moving parts, really has very little O&M or operation and maintenance cost, and that's why we're seeing this particular uptick and boom and focus on solar. The inverter is the other main component of a solar PV system. The inverter is what takes, so your solar panels produce what's called DC electricity, just kind of like a battery puts out. Our grid and our infrastructure here in these buildings is AC wiring, and so we have to convert between the two. So they can look like this and be a box. They can also be little and have one on the back of every panel. For this moment, it doesn't matter which one you have, they do the same thing. Systems typically come with web-based monitoring, which can tie into a building management system if you have one. They also have performance guarantees. So they actually guarantee, and particularly the kind of financial suggestion I'm going to make to you, which is the commercial version or nonprofit version of what Deb and Joanne are doing, you guys would get a performance production guarantee for the entire operation of the system. So these systems are all grid connected. So what does that mean? It means that we're not getting rid of NICEAG. We're not getting rid of being connected to the utility grid or the electric grid. We're changing our relationship with it. We're actually producing, not just consuming, but we are remaining a customer. There's no storage required, and I already kind of mentioned net metering is the whole thing that drives this. Either on-site net metering or remote net metering means you're able to produce your own electricity and get full and equal exchange for it. And that's what lets you produce 100% of your annual usage. So the financial options, right? Here's the heart of it. So there's 2 main ways to go solar. You guys, we're going to put a big X for this one, probably. The purchase option is great, but only if you can monetize all the incentives. So as I said, for residential customers or commercial customers, there's a grant, and there's tax credits, and there's tax depreciation. But because you guys don't pay federal or state income taxes as an organization, this is going to be less attractive financially. So what was probably make the most sense is a power purchase agreement. It's a fancy way of saying a lease at the commercial level. And what it means is that you have a monthly payment for solar, you don't put any money down, and other folks, investors, actually take all those incentives for you, and actually they can monetize them much better than you can. They build the system on your property or property that you're leasing, you get the credit for all the clean electricity, and they actually pay for it all up front, and you pay a fixed cost over time. And for a system like this, I'll show you the example, but usually you can get a monthly payment that's not that different than what you're paying now.
Is it an endless lease, or is it like a mortgage?
Yep, so it's typically they're 15, depends on the broker, but usually 15 to 25-year leases. I'd say 20 years is the average that I see in the marketplace.
Would there come a time that the people that are producing, as you say, we become producers, become shareholders in NICEAG?
That would be a totally other conversation, so no. One thing I will mention here, so with the PPA, right, which I think is by far the best way for you guys to approach it, there is a new model that's been brought out called a community PPA, which would just be the same basic idea. Someone else owns the system initially, takes all the benefits, sells you the clean electricity at a fixed, affordable price. You put no money down. In the community PPA, the only difference is that local investors can invest in the project and actually make money and be involved in it that way. So the folks who actually take all those incentives for you aren't just some strangers in New York City. They're actually people, if you want, in your community who are interested, and I can talk more about that.
Two questions. One point, nonprofits are allowed to own commercial entities, and so it would be possible to expect efficiencies of commercial.
You'd have to have tax liability, though.
Right. So if you own a commercial entity, you're tax liable for that taxes on that commercial property.
Yeah, so this is...
The second one was, could a case be made for converting our heating system to electric at the same time?
Well, I mean, that's what Bryce was trying to get into. There definitely is this initiative. With solar, you can basically go solar, most likely, if we go through the details, with no money down at all. It will be, I think, a little bit more a month than you're paying now. But that's a no capital cost way to do it. For the improvements that Bryce has been talking about, like those are more capital intensive. So definitely the goal for most buildings where everyone's headed is switching HVAC, heating and cooling, to either air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, making it all electric, as efficient and tight as possible, and then doing it all with solar. So that is where everyone's converging. What you did first would just depend on budget, whether you want to do a fundraising campaign for something. The solar is probably one of the lowest barrier, in addition to the boiler and energy efficiency stuff, all the things that he listed. That's very low-hanging fruit. This is probably the next low-hanging fruit. And then the overall HVAC systems are probably the most, highest hanging fruit, just in terms of capital. In terms of taxes, if there's a commercial entity that you guys own, that's great. Property taxes don't matter for the financial upfront costs. It's income taxes. And so it would be whether you guys pay federal or that entity pays federal income tax would be the question. So if you did a purchase without the tax incentives, so if there was not an entity who could monetize the federal income tax credit and the depreciation, then the cost for this size 45 kW system would be right around $100,000. Just assuming that may not be attractive, it's definitely an option. The PPA is kind of the no money down, kind of simplest path to lowest barrier to entry. And it would be right around an 8 cent per kilowatt hour PPA. So you guys are paying 6.5 to 7, and we can do a much harder look at that. And obviously I don't have a formal PPA here with me, but what I'm seeing in the market and using kind of our model, I think an 8 cent would be a safe bet to be able to do. And doing it through a vessel like a community PPA would be wonderful. Whether or not people end up wanting to do the investment locally, it doesn't matter. It's a great kind of program that is also open to smaller systems. So for a long time, the biggest barrier to you guys doing a PPA would be that investors in Wall Street, hedge fund managers, other folks aren't interested in a little 50 kilowatt, FUSIT system. They're interested in big stuff. And that's changed. And so now with some of these community PPAs, people are much more open to actually providing these for smaller systems, which is what you guys would be. So at this moment, I really think this is a viable possibility where if you wanted to, we could really run the numbers hard, but you could pay probably a little bit more per kilowatt hour and get 100% solar electricity feeding your facility.
PPA, please? PPA?
Power purchase agreement. So that was just back here. No, it's okay. Lots of jargon. And that's the heart of it. So that's a lot of information, but basically you have options. The way that solar is set up right now in New York, you guys have an option to go solar without the capital cost that some other types of improvements still require. This is a great time to look at it if it all sounds appealing. It probably won't cost you less than you're paying now just because of the size of the project, but it's possible that it could be in the ballpark of what you're paying now.
Melissa, with the PPA, after 20 years of a lease, you actually own the system then?
Yep. So typically, there's two options at the end of the PPA. There can be a buyout price, which has to be a fair market price at the time, at that 20 years from now time. Or you can simply sign up for a new power purchase agreement. So no, it is not by default an ownership model. We'll see. In the residential sector, people often... I can just add one thing to that. In the residential sector, people often feel like you will end up with the system because I don't want to talk over people who are talking.
One mic.
Can I see the next slide? It had the website or...
Oh, this was just our Bryce and I's contact information. Obviously, Solar Tompkins has a website up that is more focused. At this point, it's not on commercial entities or nonprofits. It's focused on residential programming that we've done this year.
So just to kind of talk about your question, there becomes a point in these power purchase agreements or leases where it becomes very advantageous for the person or the entity to buy out the system. For us, that's right at 7 years. They give you a contract that really lists everything out, and it tells you year by year what your buyout would be. And there becomes a point in there, it's like, okay, that's when we're going to do the buyout. And so that's one thing to think about. And these are things that are very detailed, and they're custom made. It would be custom made for our organization. So I think it'd be worth at least going and looking and getting a good assessment on what that might look like.
Yeah, you could explore what the goal really was of FUSIT in terms of did you want to own it, and when would you want to own it, and what economic scenario. Generally, like commercial PPAs, like a lot of folks aren't interested in owning it. They just want someone to provide them this clean electricity, and that's not always a goal of a lot of corporations, for example. And so, but all these things, even though they're standardizing the contracts, they are negotiable. And so you could figure out what you really wanted and see if it was possible.
The efficiency of the solar panels has increased substantially over the last 5 or 10 years, and so how much more efficient they can become is still a question, but
yeah. So right now,
about 30%, I think, is what the official top value is.
No, it's in the 20s.
It's 24.5% for silicon.
And that's the physical, like theoretical limit. I mean, right now, so it hasn't actually changed a lot in the last 5 years. It's a very gradual. It's kind of like perfecting something that's almost perfect. They make these very small, gradual steps upwards. Panels or cells right now are in the low 20s, 21, 22% efficient. And so we have a little ways to go before we hit that physics, like theoretical limit. So this technology is not going to change dramatically in the next, decade or more. What's coming behind it, 10, 15 plus years out, is third generation solar, which is more of like a nano solar, where we're actually getting around this limitation by going down to the subatomic level and playing with stuff and solving this problem. But that's definitely at least a decade or more out, if not longer. And these do a great job. Efficiency, when you talk about different things in terms of efficiency, they don't always mean the same thing. So solar does quite well for what it does, and it's a very mature technology. Sorry. He was pointing to you.
Everybody probably knows this, except for me. And we're talking about solar. But what I'd like to know is, because I do this all the time, does fossil fuel depend on where you live?
Does fossil fuels depend on where you live?
I mean, like, what's his name? I'm not going to say his name in Kentucky. Is reassuring the coal industry that he's going to protect them. I mean, if you come from a place that has coal, I'm from Colorado, and if you still depend on that, that's my question. Does it depend on the part of the country?
You mean
what's your source of?
You mean the carbon? You mean the carbon emission?
Well, I don't know. See, I'm ignorant about that. I want to know exactly what fossil fuels means.
Right. So I think one answer to that question is depending on what part of the country you live in, determines what mix of fossil fuels you're using currently.
And it's a mix.
Yeah, it's a mix. So almost every state has a mix, and just depending on where you are, probably then determines how many coal-fired power plants you have versus how many natural gas-fired power plants versus how many nuclear power plants. Definitely.
What I can say is that in a state like Utah, they get 90% of their electricity from coal, and in a state like New York, we get somewhere between 15 or so percent from coal. And so it's very different across the regions. Yeah.
That's what I assumed, but I didn't know.
Anyone?
Thank you.